gives a lot. It's so confusing. I just said that. To this, Chuck Murphy replied that there's no way, and I'm quoting him, "There's no way that guy crawled inside that chimney with that steel webbing. He didn't come down the chimney." He continues to say, "He was only wearing his thermal shirt, no pants, no shoes or socks," unquote. So I'm just going to correct myself from what I said earlier. He was not wearing socks. So, sorry. Basically, it's just odd that Josh stripped down and climbed down the chimney. But then it makes you take into consideration hypothermia. 20 to 50% of hypothermia deaths are associated with paradoxical undressing, which typically occurs during moderate and severe hypothermia, as the person becomes disoriented, confused, and combative. They might begin discarding their clothing, which in turn increases the rate of heat loss. I'm thinking that this could be a factor in his death if it's not a homicide. Hypothermia can also cause an altered mental status. People affected by hypothermia will also appear dazed, disoriented, or confused, and they may have slurred speech or act as though they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I don't know if it would cause someone to insert themselves into a chimney, or I don't know if someone would be, who is suffering from hypothermia, I don't know if they would be in the right mindset to take if they were undressing they were experiencing paradoxical undressing, I don't know if they were, I feel like that's something that if someone were experiencing that, they would feverishly be undressing. I don't think they would take the time to fold their clothes and place them at the bottom of the chimney. Nor do I think that they would be able to take a giant piece of wood and pull it over with them and then insert themselves. The most elaborate explanation that I can come up with in my head, while not considering it to be a homicide, is that Josh went hiking, and because the temperature, even though it was in May, it had dropped to the high 20s, which is below freezing. It's also negative 6.7 degrees Celsius. He had experienced hypothermia. He saw, since it was incredibly close to his house, the cabin, he saw it as an opportunity, as somewhere to be warm. He started to strip from the altered state of his mental status due to hypothermia. He folded his clothes somehow. He pulled the piece of wood over to the base of the chimney. He climbed onto the roof and slid himself down into the chimney. And then maybe someone had noticed, someone who would visit the cabin once in a while, and maybe saw that the mesh was misplaced on the top of the chimney, and they screwed it back on and didn't even notice that Josh was there, despite the probably pungent smell of decay that would be emitting from his remains. With all of this being said, though, I do think that we should look into some of the theories on Josh's death, and I'll get into those right now. The police had received several anonymous tip-offs suggesting leads and naming suspects that had bragged about killing Josh. One suspect, who I believe is currently incarcerated in a Texas jail and had previous time in Seattle and Portland prisons with a long history of violent crime. One tip-off had informed the police that that man had been seen with Josh, and Coroner Al Bourne had something to say about this. He said, "They can't give me times and specifics, and we can't generate stuff that goes back 7 years." He also doubted that the man would have been able to put Josh in the chimney alone. The Redditor said, "I went to high school with this skinny, dorky hippie named Andy, who played guitar in a band. I was never good friends with him or anything, but a year or so after I graduated, one of my good friends, Josh, started hanging out with him and then went missing. Turns out that in addition to becoming a lot scarier looking, Andy had indeed headed down to New Mexico, where he found himself shooting the shit with the caretaker of a disabled guy and got invited over to their apartment. Caretaker gets in the shower, and when he comes back out, the disabled guy is stabbed to death and Andy is gone. When Andy got arrested, he also claimed to have killed a woman in Teos and stuffed her body in a barrel." They continue on. "The cops had indeed found a woman stuffed in a barrel in Teos, but already had somebody in custody for it and decided to stick with that guy instead. Years later, I found out that the caretaker had died in a bar fight, and without him, the cops didn't have much in the way of evidence somehow, so that case against Andy was dropped too. Several of us went to the cops saying, Josh, who went missing was last seen with Andy, who's a murderer. Maybe you should check that out." Despite a fair amount of pestering, nothing ever really came of it. And by nothing, I mean that the police mostly didn't even return our calls, and one accidentally canceled the bulletin on Josh because he's alive and well and living in the next town over. In parentheses, he wasn't. He was actually in the chimney of an abandoned cabin like 2 blocks from his parents' house. The coroner said the body had been there for about 7 years and ruled the death accidental, concluding that Josh had probably climbed down the chimney in an attempt to break into the house and gotten stuck, which, given the age of the corpse, doesn't seem overly ridiculous, except for the fact that in addition to Josh having last been seen with Andy immediately before a stabbing spree, people have called in to report having heard rumors that Andy was bragging about having Josh put in a hole. Somebody had ripped a heavy bar off the wall in the kitchen and propped it against the fireplace, or the fact that Josh's stuff was already inside the cabin, meaning A, he'd broken in and would have had to lock himself out A, he'd already broken in and would have had to lock himself out to have to go for the chimney, and B, he might have noticed that either the flue or the big bar would have prevented him from getting in through the fireplace. Or the fact that when he was found, Josh's knees were above his head, which sounds to me like he would have had to go in head first. Disclaimer, not an expert at effing all. Or maybe the fact that Josh was barefoot and naked from the waist down. This is just my opinion, but I don't care who you are. You don't try to climb headfirst into a chimney via a hole rusted through a metal grate with your dick pardon my French, dick hanging out. As far as I can tell, nobody even bothered to call Andy to ask if he knew anything. By the way, from what I hear, Andy's still out and doing this thing when he's not in the mental hospital. All I'm saying is, I wish they had done some police S-word. Open an investigation, try to track down some leads, interview some of the folks who've been calling in tips for the last 7 years. Maybe check for some semen or something. I don't know. Don't just say accidental. Dust off your hands and call it a day. That end quote by from the Reddit post. So now more on Andy. So his full name was Andrew Richard Newman. He was arrested on suspicion of a fatal stabbing in New Mexico and is currently serving time. And I wish I could maybe I will be able to show you the photo of him that I see in the article, because he is the Redditor was right. He is incredibly he's scary. I don't know what I would do if I were to be face to face with this person. That's awful. Before I conclude this episode, I think it would be a good idea to reflect on what we just discussed in a more concise way. So Chuck Murphy said, "It's a real conundrum, a tragic, terrible story. All I know is he did not go down that chimney. He got in the fireplace and went up. But why? I think it will remain a mystery, one of those sad stories." And once again, this brings up the question of, was it foul play? Was he murdered? Or did he somehow fit himself up there? Or should I say in there? One detail that has me straying in the direction of it being foul play is the fact that the wooden bar was dragged to the base of the chimney, and the fact that his clothes were placed next to the chimney and folded nicely, yet he was only wearing a shirt and nothing else. So that is incredibly confusing to me. I do also think that he could have been taking all of his clothes off due to intense symptoms of hypothermia. I believe it's paradoxical undressing. But I'm getting off topic. I mean, I'm kind of rambling on and on about that specific part. Here's some specific things that I myself am going to consider, that I also want you to consider. The rebar in the chimney, it would have prevented the entry of anyone unless it was removed prior to the demolition or rusted away, suggested by the coroner. The mesh at the top of the chimney, I mean. And then the giant piece of wood, the breakfast bar. Why was it dragged over to the base of the chimney? How long had it been there? Did it have to do with Josh's death at all? And would it impact the way that he even got up in the chimney if it was there before he passed away? And the final time I'm going to bring up the clothes, but do you think someone took them off of him and folded them nicely, either while he was dying or after he was dying? Or do you think he did it himself? And also, do you think that there could be any DNA on the clothes that could take us somewhere? If that had not already been considered, that is. And that is the end of this episode. This episode of They Might Be Morally Correct, a podcast with an auto-generated title. Thank you for listening. I hope that this was this was interesting, and that my telling of it made sense, at least. It's incredibly sad, and my sincere condolences to Josh's family, especially now since he was found, almost 7 years ago now. Well, over 6 years now. It's going to be coming up on 7 years this summer. So, thank you for listening, Amy. Bye.